Hello and welcome to Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. We're starting into 2022 and I've asked you guys for some feedback over the last few months and I got it. So let's chat for just a moment before we begin. The overwhelming response when I asked what you wanted to see was lesser known cases. You want me to cover cases that you haven't heard about or haven't heard as much about. Now, there's a reason that true crime YouTubers and true crime podcasters all cover the same cases a lot of the time. Really famous cases are easy to get information on. They're easy to research. Unknown cases require so much more digging and so much more effort on the part of the researcher. And it makes it really tough. That's why so many people cover the same cases over and over. My grandma used to say, you can't make chicken salad out of chicken shit. Well, you're about to watch me try this year. I'm here to bring you what you want to see. These episodes are made for you guys. If you don't watch, why am I doing this? So I'm always going to go to whatever lengths I need to go to in order to bring you what you want to see. I am really going to focus on more of a mix of well-known cases and lesser-known cases. Yes, it's more work, a lot more work. But I love you and I'm happy you're here and I'm going to give you what you want. I'm excited for 2022. I have a lot of exciting things happening here at Dining with Death, and I'm happy and grateful you're willing to come along on the ride with me. Those of us who spend time learning about and listening to, watching the darker stories that happen in our world see a lot of disturbing things. Does it desensitize us? In my personal experience, people who are interested in the darker, more morbid side of life are usually very soft-hearted people at their core, so that's a tough question for me. Of all the dark things that we see, I think it's safe to say that there are certain things that bother all of us. The death of a child tops that list for most of us, but following that would probably be instances of people who kill their own flesh and blood, their own family. Throw in some wild conspiracy theories about the CIA, hitmen, and even the Kennedy assassination, and we've got one hell of a true crime story. This is the case of the Icebox murders. Let's get into it. June 23rd, 1965. A phone call comes into the Houston, Texas Police Department. A man named Marvin Martin has contacted police to tell them he is concerned about his uncle and his aunt, who are named Fred and Edwina Rogers. Marvin says he hasn't heard from them in days, and he cannot get them to answer the phone. Marvin asks that an officer be sent out to the home to do a welfare check on the elderly couple to find out if they're okay or if something has happened. Two Houston police officers, Charles Bullock and his partner L.M. Barta, are sent to the couple's home, located in the neighborhood called Montrose. The officers knocked on the front door, but there was no answer. They tried to open the door, but felt something heavy from inside blocking it. The officers then went around the side of the house to the back door of the home. Someone had stacked a lot of heavy flower pots around the back door to form kind of a barricade surrounding the door, as if they didn't want anyone using that door. Now the officers were suspicious. They moved the pots aside and tried the back door handle. It was open. The police officers cautiously moved inside the home. Later, Officer Bullock said, "My suspicions shifted to adrenaline. Something just didn't feel right." The two men began searching through the home, calling out for anyone who might be inside to reveal themselves. They identified themselves as the police and yelled out that they were here to search the home. They got no reply. The officers looked in the home's bedroom. There sat a fan blowing near the bed, and Edwina's false teeth were on the nightstand. I'm sure many of you know people with false teeth, and you know that those people do not leave the house without them, so this was an ominous sign to the officers. They then checked the living room and the spare rooms as well. There was no one there. As they looked through the home, they passed by the kitchen several times and saw that it too was vacant, but there was food sitting on plates at the kitchen table as though someone had been eating. After their cursory search of the home, the officers decided to start looking through closets and cabinets. They were concerned. Fred and Edwina were old and they were feeble, and they didn't leave their home that often and apparently never left their home without telling someone where they were going. It was unheard of for them to ignore phone calls, especially over the course of several days. The police officers knew this, and so they decided to investigate a little further. As they went through the kitchen cabinets, they didn't find anything unusual, but then they came to the refrigerator. One officer opened the door and was surprised by what he saw. The entire refrigerator was packed full of neatly wrapped packages of meat. He said they were the kind of packages you get at the butcher when you buy hog meat. The refrigerator was packed entirely full of them. You couldn't get another thing in there. Although finding this much meat in a refrigerator was unusual, it wasn't really cause for alarm, so the police officer went to close the refrigerator door. As he did so, he looked down at the vegetable crisper drawers, which were made out of glass. Inside the glass drawers were 2 decapitated human heads. The officer then realized he wasn't looking at hog meat.
We received a call out here that the nephew could not locate his grandparents.
It's been 23 years since Captain Charles Bullock received the call that hot June evening. There is nothing but an overgrown lot to remind him of what happened here.
When we arrived at the location, we tried to get through the front door.
The windows were shut, but the back door was open.
We didn't see a thing in the house. The house was neatly clean, although we figured they couldn't be very far because there was a fan on in the back bedroom, and her teeth, false teeth, were laying on the table.
After 30 minutes in the house, no one could figure what happened to the elderly couple. Something wasn't right.
I don't know if you ever remember going off on vacation or something, being away a few days, but if you ever open your refrigerator, there's a little musty smell there. We just opened the refrigerator up, just out of curiosity. And when we opened it up, well, all we could see was just meat packed in there. You couldn't get anything else in there because it's just completely full of meat. As it was getting ready to close the refrigerator, the vegetable bin down at the bottom is glass. And as I started to close the refrigerator, well, I seen the head of one of them, and then I knew what the rest of it was.
The officers then radioed for backup and told their dispatcher they needed the homicide division on the scene. As officers descended upon the small home, the shock and horror of what they had found began to set in. A coroner was brought to the home as the officers began to unpack the refrigerator. As they started to open the many packages, one by one, it became gruesomely apparent. Fred and Edwina Rogers had been murdered, cut up, packaged like meat from the butcher, and stored in their own refrigerator. Well, most of them had been stored in the refrigerator. As police began to search the grounds of the home and the surrounding areas, one of them made a helpful but horrific suggestion. He said, "We better check the sewers." They did. There they found the soft tissues and intestines of Fred and Edwina Rogers. Someone had either flushed body parts down the toilet or dumped the parts in a nearby storm drain access. It also became apparent that before Fred and Edwina were butchered, their bodies had been exsanguinated, totally and completely drained of blood. Upon further inspection, it was discovered that Fred Rogers' eyeballs had been forcefully removed from their sockets and his genitals had been cut off. Both Fred's eyes and his other parts were found dumped in the sewer. The 2 heads were removed from the vegetable crisper drawers and examined. Edwina had been shot in the head, and Fred had been bludgeoned with a hammer. Police surmised that after the 2 were murdered, they were then drained of blood in their own bathtub and were then butchered. As investigators pictured what had happened, they were astonished at the total lack of blood in the home. This was neat. This was done with care, and it took a lot of time. Whatever mess might have been made had been thoroughly cleaned up. Not until a much more thorough search was performed did the police find any blood, and when they did, it wasn't very much. Fred and Edwina's family members were contacted and informed of the grisly discovery. Their first question, where is Charles? Charles Rogers was the 43-year-old son of Fred and Edwina Rogers, and he was unusual, to say the least. Charles lived in the home with Fred and Edwina, but the 3 people did not communicate at all. Charles lived entirely in his bedroom and never came out when his parents were awake. He left the home each day early in the morning and came home late at night. Charles never spoke to his parents. The 3 family members communicated by slipping notes under the door of Charles' bedroom. Once in a great while, neighbors would see Charles outside the house, but it was a very rare occurrence. So where was this man, who was so reclusive and so mysterious that he was rarely seen? He was nowhere to be found. Police had already searched his room, but now they were looking closer. There was blood near the keyhole of the bedroom doorknob. Charles Rogers was not murdered alongside his parents, but he was definitely not in the house. Days went by and he did not reappear at the house. Charles Rogers had vanished. In the days after the discovery, more information is uncovered by investigators, and they conclude that the murder had actually taken place days earlier on Father's Day. As they began to look into the unusual living arrangement inside the home and who Fred, Edwina, and Charles Rogers actually were, the case grows even stranger.
Investigators concluded the murders actually happened the Sunday before, on Father's Day. Edwina, savagely beaten, shot execution style. Fred Rogers' head crushed with a hammer, eyes gouged out, emasculated, internal organs flushed down the sewer. But it's more than its grisly detail that makes it one of the most notorious crimes in Texas history. It's the shadowy character of Charles Rogers, whose keen mind and alleged government connections still baffle and intrigue.
Because Charles Rogers rarely left his bedroom and was now missing, he became the prime suspect in the murder of his parents. Police began an intensive manhunt for him.
The mutilated bodies of 81-year-old Frederick Rogers and his 79-year-old wife Edwina had been stuffed in the refrigerator. The Rogers' 43-year-old son lived at home with his parents, and although his car was parked in the driveway, he was never seen again.
We do know that the boy lived with his parents, and as of this minute, we have not been able to locate him, or neither do we know too much about him.
But before we talk too much about Charles, we need to talk about Fred and Edwina. They might look like a kindly, genteel, elderly couple, but as we all know, looks can be deceiving. Fred and Edwina were con artists, and they were thieves. Investigators began really looking into their lives, and what they found shocked them. The Rogers had taken out multiple loans using their son's name and personal information. They had defaulted on many of those loans, which resulted in Charles having judgments against him and having creditors pursuing him. The Rogers stole from their son. They robbed him each and every time he left the house. They manipulated bank records to get access to his bank records, and then they robbed him of his entire savings. And they had basically made his life kind of a living hell. That is the reason the trio did not speak. That is the reason Charles bought his own lock and kept his bedroom locked up each day when he left the home. He despised his parents, but because they had ruined him financially, he was forced to live with them. Charles Rogers was no ordinary man. He had served in World War II and he knew how to fly a plane. He also knew how to take apart and reassemble weapons. He had even engaged in hand-to-hand combat in the war and knew how to kill with his hands. After the war, Charles went to college and graduated with a degree in nuclear physics. This was an incredibly intelligent human being. He was courted by several large corporations right out of college because his grades were so good, and he eventually went to work for Shell Oil as a seismologist. Police immediately began to search for Charles Rogers. They checked airports and bus stations. They put up wanted posters. They aired his photograph on the news. They even had border agents checking for him at all border crossings into Mexico and Canada. They looked for him for weeks, and then months, and then years. They never found him. To this day, Charles Rogers remains vanished. He was 43 years old in 1965. On the off chance he is alive today, he would be 99 years old, so he is most likely dead. No one ever found a trace of Charles Rogers. He disappeared like a puff of smoke. Now, although Charles has a very interesting background as a veteran and combat specialist and pilot and nuclear physicist, that is just the tip of the iceberg. As the investigation and the search for Charles Rogers continued, some very strange and mysterious information was uncovered. Now, from here on out in the story, your perception of the truth will be determined by who you choose to believe. And you'll have to pick a side because the two schools of thought on Charles Rogers are very, very different. November 22nd, 1963. We're going back in time 2 years to this infamous date. I'm sure many of you already recognize it. This is the date that President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas as he rode in a convertible to wave to the crowds who had gathered to see him. Immediately after the president was shot, as he was rushed to Parkland Hospital, police began rounding up suspects. There was a group of men taken in for questioning that historians have since labeled the Three Tramps. You can see these men in a series of photographs that were taken on the day of the assassination. Now, I'm not much of a conspiracy theorist, but I do find it a bit odd that so many photographs of these men exist. I know most of you don't spend time researching historical events like I do, but this is something very unusual for someone like me. I have a hard time digging up a single photo on some of these older cases. Now, the Kennedy assassination is not just any event, I understand that, but why are there so many photos of these three men? It's almost like someone told the press, make sure you take photos of these guys, you'll thank me later. Now, I'm not saying that that's what happened. I'm just saying that yes, it is very, very strange to have so many high-quality photos of a bunch of hobos on a day when hundreds and hundreds of people were interviewed by the police. Here's the theory about the Three Tramps. In 1967, a conspiracy theorist named Richard E. Sprague compiled this collection of photographs of the Three Tramps because he too found it odd that they were such a big focus on this chaotic day. Richard Sprague turned the photos over to Jim Garrison, who was a district attorney investigating the assassination of the president. During his investigation, he prosecuted a man named Clay Shaw, claiming that he was the man who killed Kennedy. Now, Clay Shaw was eventually acquitted of the charges, but Richard Sprague, the conspiracy theorist, thought the photos of the Three Tramps might be helpful to District Attorney Garrison as he attempted to build a case against Clay Shaw. Now, we all know that Lee Harvey Oswald has been blamed for the assassination, but even right after the shooting, other people thought others were involved. This Clay Shaw person was one of those people. So this attorney actually went on an episode of The Tonight Show in 1968 and held up a photo of the Three Tramps and told the national audience that he was convinced that these three men had something to do with the assassination of the president. Now, we could do an entire episode on the Three Tramps. It's actually all quite fascinating. But the base theory is that these three men, dressed as derelict hobos, were actually CIA agents in disguise. This theory lived on for decades, and in 1992, two men wrote a book that includes information about the Tramps. The authors are John R. Craig and Philip A. Rogers, and the book is called The Man on the Grassy Knoll. This book goes into much more detail and some feel makes a strong case for CIA involvement in the assassination of President Kennedy. Now, how does this tie into Charles Rogers, and why are we talking about the Three Tramps after talking about the Icebox murders? How did we get to the Kennedy assassination from a little house in Houston, Texas, where an elderly couple is found butchered and packaged in their refrigerator? What does this have to do with Charles Rogers? Well, you see, some people believe that you are looking at Charles Rogers right now. There are people who believe that Charles Rogers, the man who was supposedly so financially and emotionally devastated by his own parents, was actually a covert CIA operative. While Charles Rogers was a member of the Civil Air Patrol, he became close friends with a man named David Ferrie. We don't have the time here to go down the rabbit hole on David Ferrie, but basically David Ferrie was an outspoken political person and he was friends with Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who ultimately took the blame for President Kennedy's assassination, and then was himself shot and killed on live TV in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters by Jack Ruby. Now again, there is some controversy on whether or not this is a fact, but it appears that Charles Rogers did join the CIA in 1956 while working at Shell Oil. The CIA doesn't put its employment records on blast, but there is some pretty convincing evidence that it counted Charles Rogers on its roster. Charles was a known associate of a man named Carlos Marcello. Carlos was basically a drug lord who did some prison time, and when he was released, went to work for Frank Costello, the leader of the mafia in New York. For you Kennedy historians, you know that there are a lot of ties between Kennedy and the mafia, most of which are not friendly. In the book, The Man on the Grassy Knoll, the authors claim that Charles Rogers was working with Lee Harvey Oswald and the other men to carry out the assassination of the president. The authors further claim that Charles Rogers and a man named Charles Harrison, posing as tramps, hobos, were actually disguised assassins hiding behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll, and that they fired one or some of the shots that killed the president. Now, of course, this all plays into the theory that President Kennedy was shot from different angles and multiple times, when the official statement is that he was shot twice and that both shots came from the same location. But the working theory in this particular school of thought, the conspiracy side of things, is that Charles Rogers was a government assassin and had been working undercover for many years behind the scenes to assist the CIA in maneuvering political figures and taking out those that didn't play ball.
The evil government agency theory bloomed in the early 1990s with a book called The Man on the Grassy Knoll.
Charles Rogers was a covert agent of the CIA. He was recruited in 1956 here in Houston, at first as a contract agent. Then when he resigned from Shell, he became a full-time operative in the Latin American activities. The motive for killing his parents was to silence them, because we believe that his mother, at least, found out that he had been involved in the conspiracy to assassinate the president a year and a half before.
Most serious Kennedy scholars consider Phillips' book absolute baloney. It claims that Rogers was one of the so-called well-dressed tramps picked up on the day of the assassination and released. Their arrest records weren't found until 1992.
Now, that would definitely explain why Charles Rogers abruptly quit his job with Shell Oil in 1957 without any notice and without any reason given. He simply announced that he was quitting and left his job one day, and his co-workers never heard from him again. Maybe you do that if you're waiting tables at one place and a better gig comes along at a different restaurant, but for a nuclear physicist working in seismology for one of the biggest oil companies in the world to just up and quit, it raised more than a few eyebrows. It would also explain where Charles Rogers was going every day at the crack of dawn, staying out all day, and not returning home until after dark, even though he didn't have a job. The other thing you need to know about Charles is that he spoke not just one or two, but 7 languages fluently. He was also very invested in a sophisticated ham radio setup and spent a lot of time in his room on that radio talking with other operators. Now remember, earlier in the episode, I told you that Charles kept his bedroom door locked because his parents would steal from him when he was not at home, and it's not just a theory that they stole from him, it was proven by forensic accounting investigations. They really did clean out his savings account and ruin him financially, at least on the books that everyone knows about. But in the theory that Charles is a secret CIA operative, there exists a diary that Charles kept in his room, and in this diary, he wrote down important names and dates and details surrounding his movements within and outside of his work for the CIA. The theory goes that Charles' mother was very nosy and would pick up the phone and listen in on Charles' phone conversations, which caused a lot of fighting and distrust in the family. The theory then states that Charles' mother must have picked the lock to his bedroom door while he was out one day, and that as she was snooping, she came upon this diary. She read the diary and confronted Charles, informing him that she knew who he was and what he was doing. Maybe she attempted to blackmail him, realizing that he had a secret bank account where he was being paid by the CIA, and this is why Charles murdered his parents. Theorists say he was already angry with Fred and Edwina for robbing him, for ruining his credit, for ruining his financial life, and treating him so terribly. When he found out that they knew he was associated with the assassination of the President of the United States, it was a no-brainer. He had to kill them. That would explain why it seemed to be a very spur-of-the-moment event. The couple was either eating dinner or preparing to eat dinner, something Charles never came out of his room for. So perhaps they weren't expecting to see him. And then he appeared in the kitchen, shot his mother, and beat his father to death with the hammer. Why didn't he shoot his father? I don't have an answer for that, but the fact that he emasculated him shows the level of anger Charles had for the man, assuming it was Charles that committed the murders. If Charles was a CIA operative, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me why he would spend hours and hours draining the bodies of blood and then carefully and neatly cutting them up and packaging them to look like meat from the butcher. That doesn't really jive with the whole covert ninja-style assassination, but it does jive with, hey, I absolutely hate these two people, and not only are they going out, but you're going to remember them going out. It's all a very big mystery, and I'm excited to hear your theories on this one. I'm not really sure what I think, so let me know what you do. 1972. The house at 1815 Driscoll Street in the Montrose neighborhood of Houston, Texas, the site of one of the most grisly and gruesome discoveries ever made by the Houston Police Department, is torn down. It had sat vacant for 7 years. Attempts were made to sell it, but surprisingly, no one wanted to buy it. It fell into disrepair and was then razed. Townhomes were built on the former home site.
This is 1815 Driscoll today. No one has lived here since the day of the murders. The house stayed vacant until 1972 when it was torn down, left a vacant lot. These condominiums were finished in the summer of 2000 but remain unsold.
1975. The investigation continues. A Houston forensic accountant named Hugh Gardenier and Martha Hughes became very involved in the case and continued to look for Charles Rogers. They uncovered information on Fred Rogers that proved he was a bookie who was engaged in not only illegal gambling, but fraud. The Gardeniers don't buy into the theory that Charles was a CIA operative. They believe he was simply a man devastated by his father and mother's betrayal, that he was angry he was forced to live with them because of what they did to him, and that one day he just snapped. The Gardeniers believe that after Charles murdered and butchered his parents, he fled the United States and went to Mexico with the help of some very wealthy and powerful friends he made while working in the oil industry, people that he also communicated with regularly via ham radio. The Gardeniers' theory states that Charles never wanted for work because these same people helped him get lucrative jobs in Mexico in the oil drilling industry, working for various oil and mining companies. In this same theory, Charles ends up in Honduras, working at a large mine there. The Gardeniers have written accounts of people stating that an American man who would have been Charles' age and who resembled Charles was a supervisor at this mine. They say Charles worked there for some time, and that one day, after a long-standing dispute over wages erupted, Charles was killed by the mine workers.
We've never found any evidence, anything at all, that would substantiate Charles Rogers being involved with the CIA.
For years, Houston investigators Hugh Gardenier and Martha Hughes have tracked the real Charles Rogers.
People that knew him and had worked with him on projects have said that he was a very hard worker and very bright and very good at what he did.
By all accounts, Rogers was a brilliant geologist with a knack for finding gas and oil and gold. A pilot who spoke 7 languages and probably fled to Mexico and Central America.
He had very powerful friends.
He brought in the mines, he brought in the wells for people. And they continued to make money, and so they were not going to give him up. Some of the people that he ran with during the late 50s, early 60s, were contract workers for the CIA at one time or another.
And we were a group of professional treasure hunters.
A.M. Van Fossen is a legend in treasure hunting circles, known widely as Gold Dust Ernie. He and Charles Rogers had mutual friends.
Charles Rogers was a ham operator here in Houston. And of course, he was down in Mexico and South and Central America. So he talked to a lot of his people that he had connection with. This is the ham, his call numbers, and his name.
Van Fossen found the ham radio plate after the Rogers house was torn down. He's fairly certain that Rogers and others he ran with did have CIA connections.
Not in a permanent position, but in a spot position. When they were going someplace and they would be contacted, would you mind looking into such and such and keeping your eyes open for this or that?
There's no shortage of unanswered questions, but they all begin with why the parents were murdered in the way they were.
What would cause a person so much rage?
Years and years and years of frustration and abuse.
Hughes and Gardner claim that Fred Rogers, a bookie by trade, abused Charles as a child and stole from him as an adult, forging his name to sell 2 lots while Charles was out of the country.
He had been swindled out of a considerable amount of money by his parents.
Everybody that I know that knew the mother and the father said they were devious con artists.
Everything that we've uncovered indicates that he actually plotted this crime probably for years.
He was an angry man that never broke the umbrella of his parents, apparently until this event.
Not long ago, a Houston police artist used old photos to construct an image of what Charles Rogers might look like now.
The Gardner's theory is much more plausible, and they were able to convince a Houston judge that they were correct. This judge declared Charles Rogers dead in 1975 so his estate could be probated. Even after he was declared dead, no trace of Charles Rogers was ever found. This case still remains officially unsolved, and Charles Rogers remains the one and only suspect. I bet you didn't think when we started talking about the murder of an elderly couple in their home, we would take a trip through the Kennedy assassination, did you? But this is the nature of true crime and why so many of us find these cases fascinating. You never know where the trail will lead, but sometimes when you follow it, you're left with more questions than when you started the journey. Thank you for joining me today on Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. I sure appreciate you watching. I sure appreciate you being here. If you have not subscribed to the channel yet and you like the content, it really helps me out if you subscribe. Stay safe and be kind to each other, and I'll see you next time on Dining with Death. Bye.